Welcome back to Crimetime Inc. Today we're exploring the life and times of Arthur Thompson, a man who reigned over Glasgow's underworld for over 30 years.
A fascinating figure, really. His story is just full of criminal activity, tense alliances, and bitter rivalries. And what makes it even more interesting is that even though he was so involved in organized crime, Thompson rarely spent a lot of time in jail. The question is, how did he get away with it for so long?
Let's go back to the start. Could you paint us a picture of Arthur Thompson's early days? Like, what kind of world did he come from?
Okay, so picture Glasgow in the 1950s. It's this gritty industrial city with a really rough underbelly. And Thompson, he starts small, working as a moneylender in the city slums. Even back then, he was known to be ruthless. There are stories about him actually nailing debtors to the floor to make them pay.
Wow, that definitely suggests he wasn't your typical businessman.
Oh yeah, violence, that was like his trademark, his way of showing he was in charge and making people afraid of him. He didn't stay in petty crime for long, though. He quickly moved on to more profitable things. Protection rackets, dealing in stolen goods, illegal gambling, you name it.
So he went from the slums to building this criminal empire. Sounds like he was a real strategist.
He was. He was really good at spotting opportunities, and he wasn't afraid to use force to take advantage of them. It was also around this time that he started making connections with some other big names in the criminal world, guys like the Kray twins down in London.
The Kray twins, I've definitely heard of them. Weren't they major players in London's underworld?
Oh, absolutely. They were a force to be reckoned with. But even they needed guys from Glasgow, these tough enforcers, and Thompson was one of their go-to guys.
So he was building a reputation that went way beyond Glasgow.
Exactly. And this reputation just grew stronger when he got the nickname Bomber Thompson.
Something tells me he didn't get that nickname for handing out Christmas presents.
You got that right. He earned it because of his, shall we say, enthusiasm for explosives. He'd use them to intimidate rivals or to take over businesses, mostly targeting pubs and gambling dens that didn't want to play ball with him.
Sounds like he had a pretty direct way of getting his message across. All this criminal activity must have made him a ton of money. Did he just flash it around, or was he smarter than that?
Thompson was a smart guy. He knew that to stay in power, he needed to look legit, so he invested heavily in legitimate businesses. Scrapyards, pubs, dance halls, all of them fronts for money laundering.
So while building this empire, he was crafting a nice, respectable image. Classic gangster move. But did this facade of legitimacy help him stay out of trouble with the law?
To a certain extent, yes, but it couldn't protect him completely from the violence that was all around him. In 1966, someone put a bomb in his car and it exploded, tragically killing his mother-in-law, Maggie Johnston.
That's awful. It seems even with all his careful planning, danger was always lurking around the corner.
And the way Thompson reacted to this just solidified his reputation for being utterly ruthless. Patrick Welsh and James Goldie, the guy suspected of planting the bomb, were found dead not long after. Their car had been deliberately crashed into a lamppost.
A very clear message. You don't mess with Arthur Thompson and get away with it.
You got it. The police thought Thompson was behind it, but as always, nobody was willing to talk. This incident really showed how much control he had over the city and the people in it.
It sounds like he created this aura of being untouchable. But every powerful figure has rivals, right? Were there other big players in Glasgow's underworld challenging Thompson's dominance?
There were, but they often worked in different ways. Take Walter Norvell, for example. He was around at the same time as Thompson, but he was a master planner. His gang, the XYY mob, specialized in meticulously planned armed robberies.
So while Thompson was all about intimidation and brute force, Norvell was more about precision and minimizing violence.
Exactly. Their approaches to crime were as different as their personalities. And it's kind of interesting, while Thompson seemed to avoid getting caught, Norvell's downfall came from inside his own gang.
You mean someone betrayed him? Someone in his inner circle talked?
Exactly. An informant spilled the beans on how the XYY mob operated, which led to Norvell and his guys getting sent to prison for a long time. It makes you wonder how Thompson managed to keep his people so loyal.
Was it genuine loyalty? Or were they just terrified of what would happen if they crossed him?
It's hard to say for sure, but what's clear is that, unlike Norvell, Thompson rarely had people in his own organization betray him. He seemed to know how to keep everyone in line.
Sounds like a delicate balancing act, making people loyal while also making them fear him. But, as you mentioned earlier, things were changing in Glasgow's underworld. A new threat emerged in the 1980s, right? Heroin.
Yes, that's right. And Thompson, always the opportunist, saw the potential for huge profits in this new market. He didn't just dip his toes in the heroin trade, he went all in, aiming to control it. He even brought his son, Arthur Thompson Jr., into the business.
So the Godfather brings his heir apparent into the family business.
But this wasn't your typical father-son apprenticeship. The drug world is a dangerous place full of betrayal and backstabbing. And that became really clear when Thompson Jr. was sold a batch of heroin that had been cut with a bunch of other stuff.
I bet that was seen as a huge sign of disrespect, not only to him, but also to his father.
Oh, you better believe it. It was a direct attack on their authority. Thompson Jr., wanting to prove himself, reacted with a wave of violence, but it landed him in prison for drug offenses.
So violence is deeply rooted in this family's history. But there's another name we haven't mentioned yet who plays a big role in all of this. Paul Ferris. How does he fit into the story?
Paul Ferris was a young and ambitious gangster who started out working for Thompson Sr. as an enforcer. He was basically Thompson Jr.'s protector. But Ferris was ambitious, and some say he felt like the Thompsons had betrayed him. He ended up turning against them and becoming a major rival in the drug trade.
Wow, so now we have a real power struggle brewing, a clash between the old guard and this new force. This is where things get really interesting.
You could say that. This clash would set off a chain reaction of violence and betrayals that would change the face of Glasgow's underworld forever. As Thompson Sr. was trying to, hang on to his power in this increasingly crazy drug trade, he started facing threats from more than just his rivals. I mean, people from outside his usual circle were coming after him.
Yeah, I was reading about the attacks on Thompson Sr. in the late 80s and early 90s. It seemed like he had enemies everywhere.
He did. In 1988, he was the target of this, really bold assassination attempt. Believe it or not, the IRA was involved. They actually sent a hitman to a scrapyard where Thompson was working.
The IRA. Wow, that adds a whole other layer to this story. What happened? Did they actually get him?
Well, the hitman, he walks right up to Thompson, pulls out his gun, aims it, and then the gun jams.
Oh, wow. Talk about a lucky break. Or maybe divine intervention, if you believe in that sort of thing.
It was chaos. The hitman ran off, there was shooting, and Thompson, somehow he survived. And of course, he claimed his injuries were from a lathe malfunctioning, sticking to his usual story of not cooperating with the police.
Right, because everyone knows malfunctioning lathes are famous for causing gunshot wounds. But this wasn't the last time someone tried to kill him, right?
No, I'm not even close. In 1990, he was the victim of a brutal hit and run right outside his mansion, the Ponderosa.
I read a journalist's account of that attack. Thompson's injuries were really bad.
Yeah, broken leg, cuts all over, broken nose, fingers, bruised ribs, the whole 9 yards. His enemies were getting bolder, more determined to take him down.
But it wasn't just physical attacks he had to deal with. His personal life was falling apart too, wasn't it?
Yes. His daughter, Margaret, she overdosed on heroin in 1989. It was a tragic reminder of just how destructive the very business he was in was.
The consequences of his own actions coming back to haunt him in the most personal way possible. But I think the biggest blow is still to come. The death of his son, Arthur Thompson Jr.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In 1991, Thompson Jr. was let out of prison on leave just a few days before he was supposed to be released. He was shot and killed right outside his family's house.
What a brazen attack. Did anyone doubt who was behind it?
All signs pointed to Paul Ferris, the former protege turned rival.
It sounds like a scene from a gangster movie. The heir to the throne is gunned down, and the prime suspect is the former enforcer who turned against him.
And the drama didn't end there. On the day of Thompson Jr.'s funeral, two of Ferris's associates, Bobby Glover and Joe Bananas Hanlon, they were found dead in a car. They'd been shot execution style.
That's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah.
It seems clear that Thompson Sr. wasn't just going to let his son's murder go.
Oh, the timing and the where they were killed. There was no doubt about the message being sent. Everyone assumed that Thompson Sr. had ordered the killings to get revenge.
An eye for an eye. But like a lot of the crimes connected to Thompson, he was never officially linked to these murders, was he?
Nope. The underworld has its own rules, its own code of silence. Witnesses were scared to talk, and any evidence, well, it just disappeared. The case went unsolved.
So even after all the personal tragedy and pressure from his rivals, Thompson Sr. managed to hold on to power.
His control was slipping, that's for sure. But his reputation, the fear people had of him, that was enough to keep him going for a little while longer. He was a survivor. He'd been through a lot.
But even the most powerful figures can't live forever. What finally ended Arthur Thompson Sr.'s reign?
Well, it wasn't a rival's bullet or another bombing that took him out. In 1993, just a couple years after his son's murder, Arthur Thompson Sr. died of a heart attack.
It's almost anticlimactic. After a life filled with violence and bloodshed, he dies peacefully in his sleep.
There is a certain irony to it, isn't there? A man who lived by the sword, always surrounded by danger and death, ends up dying from something as ordinary as a heart attack. I guess it shows that even the toughest guys are vulnerable in the end.
So what's the legacy of Arthur Thompson, the infamous Godfather of Glasgow?
It's complicated. He was a ruthless criminal who caused a lot of pain and suffering, but he was also a product of his environment, you know? He fought his way to the top in a city full of poverty and violence.
He's definitely a fascinating character. People are still interested in his life and death even today.
They are. He represents a dark part of Glasgow's history. His story is a reminder of how seductive power can be and how destructive a life of crime is.
It also makes you think about the bigger picture, the social conditions that lead to violence and desperation.
Yeah, for sure. By understanding what drives people to do these things, the circumstances that lead them down those dark paths, maybe we can try to build a more just and fair society. A society where young people have a real chance at a better life, a life that doesn't involve crime.
Well said. That's a powerful message, especially after hearing about Arthur Thompson's life and the impact his actions had. We've really dug into the life and legacy of Arthur Thompson, a man who left his mark on Glasgow. His story raises a lot of questions. What do you think is the most significant impact he had on the city's criminal world?
You know, it's interesting. Thompson kind of represents a turning point in Glasgow's underworld. He was from the old school, a time when power was all about brute force and reputation. His methods, well, they were brutal, but in a way, they were simpler than the organized crime you see today.
That's a good point. His tactics were shockingly violent, but there's a certain, straightforwardness to them. Everyone knew what Bomber Thompson was capable of. But after he died, it seems like the rules changed.
Exactly. When Thompson died, nobody could really fill his shoes. The power shifted, it became more spread out, and maybe even more dangerous.
We talked about how heroin became a big problem in the 80s. How did Thompson's involvement in that, especially what happened with his son, contribute to his downfall?
The heroin trade, it was a whole different game. Big money, but also super unpredictable and violent. It attracted a new kind of criminal, younger, more ruthless, and ready to challenge the established order. Thompson tried to control this new market, but it backfired, and he ended up in a vulnerable position.
The story about Thompson Jr. being sold diluted heroin seemed like a big turning point. It was like a direct challenge, something he couldn't ignore.
Absolutely. It showed that he wasn't untouchable, that even the Godfather could be betrayed. And it also kind of foreshadowed the rise of Paul Ferris, who was part of this new generation of criminals, not afraid of the old guard.
What happened next? The murders of Thompson Jr., Glover, and Hanlon. It's also dramatic, like something out of Shakespeare. Do you think those events were a turning point for Glasgow's underworld?
No doubt about it. Those killings, no matter who was behind them, they destroyed any sense of order or control. It was the start of a much more violent and unpredictable time. Thompson Sr. might have survived, but things had changed forever.
It's like the old rules didn't apply anymore. Brute force and a fearsome reputation weren't enough to survive in this new world.
That's right. The heroin trade, with its quick money and ruthless players, changed the whole hierarchy. Thompson tried to adapt, but he just couldn't keep up.
It's a fascinating look at how crime evolves. The old ways clashing with the new, with some pretty tragic consequences. What do you think the lasting effects of Arthur Thompson and everything that happened after he died are?
I think his story shows us that crime is like a cycle. The people and methods might change, but the root causes, things like poverty, inequality, and lack of opportunity, they stay the same. As long as those problems exist, people will be tempted by easy money and power, no matter the risk.
So even though Thompson's time is over, the problems that led to his rise are still there, just in different forms. Kind of depressing, isn't it?
It is. Thompson's story isn't just about one man, it's about the bigger problems in our society.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening look at Arthur Thompson's life and what he meant for Glasgow's underworld. It's a story full of twists and turns, violence and sadness, but it makes us think about the nature of crime and the society we live in.
I agree. It's a story that sticks with you, it makes you think, and maybe understand a little bit more about the things that shape the world.
I'm sure Simon will have some personal experiences related to this podcast, so I can't wait to hear what he has to say on Sunday. But in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.